Excellent. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm Jason Karlowicz, co-director of the Penn Memory Center, and joining me is my colleague, David.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining on this kind of momentous week. I'm Dave Walk. I'm co-director of the Memory Center with Jason.
David and I are going to make some opening remarks about the events around the approval of aducanumab by the Food and Drug Administration last week on Monday. And then we're going to answer a series of questions. Many questions have already arrived, and we'll be answering those. In addition, as questions arise, as Terry Casey instructed, please just put them in the chat room. We're confident that we will not answer all of your questions, given the number that we've received. And we're also confident that this is the beginning, not the end, of a conversation about this drug. So our ask to you at the beginning is to please relay to us what more we should be doing to foster a discussion of this drug, and more generally the topics this drug approval has raised. Our mission, as part of our academic mission, is to foster understanding, to advance the treatment, diagnosis, and care of persons living with Alzheimer's and related disorders. And so your suggestions are really quite valuable. So to begin, I'm going to put up a couple slides that I think occasionally, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so I will do that now. Oops. I had it up. There we go. So, the topic of discussion today is the drug aducanumab. Aducanumab is a monoclonal antibody that binds to amyloid in the brain of a human. Amyloid is, of course, one of the pathologies implicated to cause the death of neurons, in other words, neurodegeneration that causes mild cognitive impairment and ultimately dementia in persons with Alzheimer's disease. The drug is owned by a company, Biogen. And on the right there is the cover of Nature magazine from 2016, which depicted one of the groundbreaking studies of this drug, which showed how the drug cleared amyloid from the brain of a human. So back in 2016, this was the cover of Nature. You can see the brain on the left has evidence from PET imaging of amyloid, and the brain on the right has no evidence of amyloid. And that was the story of that very important study that showed that aducanumab cleared amyloid from the brain. That study was provocative with some signals that the drug may also have an effect on the course of the disease. That is to say, the functional and cognitive impairments patients experience. It was a signal, it needed confirmation. And to confirm that, the company did two studies called Engage and Emerge. Engage and Emerge, about a year or so ago, 2 years ago, please don't quote me on the dates, were halted for futility, an analysis done to determine whether or not the studies had a chance of actually showing an effect. They're often put into studies, particularly done by sponsors, so that they can decide whether it's worth the time and money to continue developing a drug. Without going into the details of what then happened, additional data came in while the data were being analyzed, and the larger data set that was available was reanalyzed, and the company discovered that one of the studies showed an effect of the drug greater than placebo. The other study, though, remained negative. In fact, placebo performed better than the drug. These data were submitted to the FDA for approval for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. In November of last year, the FDA convened an advisory committee. This is a custom of FDA, very typical, to ask a committee to review a company's application for the approval of a drug and answer specific questions about whether the drug should be approved. The committee, across a number of questions, was unanimous in its vote against approval of the drug as a safe and effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease. That day ended and time passed. In January or so of this year, the company announced that FDA had asked them for additional data and had extended the deadline for the announcement from roughly a January-February date, actually a March date, I'm sorry about that, to the June date that just occurred last week, for the decision on the drug. The data that were presented, as I said, showed in the eMERGE study that there was an effect on a measure of clinical response, the CDR, or clinical dementia rating. And again, in the other study, that was not the finding. Further analysis, though, of the ENGAGE study by removing certain subjects suggested that you could see an effect in the ENGAGE study. Without going into great detail, one of the concerns raised by the advisory board were those kind of analyses that are often done to generate exploratory hypotheses, but not considered the kind of analyses that should be done to decide if the drug is safe and effective for prescription and sale. Another finding from the studies was that aducanumab causes a well-described side effect that's been known for a number of years across a variety of these different anti-amyloid drugs, a side effect called ARIA. It's an abbreviation, and that occurs in about a third of individuals. Notably, it's related to not just the dosage of the drug, but also whether someone carries a copy of the ApoE4 gene, the gene associated with a late onset risk of of developing late onset Alzheimer's disease. Just last week on Monday, the FDA issued an announcement that they had approved aducanumab. It's very important to understand the regulations that they use to approve the drug. I realize most of us understand that FDA's job is to decide whether a drug is safe and effective for treatment. Safe and effective means based on clinical measures. Clinical measures is medical talk or doctor talk for the things that doctors ask patients about and patients tell doctors about, how they're feeling, how they're doing. Measures of things that would describe someone's health. In the case of persons living with Alzheimer's disease, those would be measures certainly of cognition, but even more importantly, day-to-day function, the ability to manage money, medications, transportation, technology, those kind of very real-world measures. The decision that FDA reached was not on the basis of those kinds of measures. Instead, FDA used a different set of regulations. The regulations that are known as the accelerated approval mechanism. The accelerated approval mechanism allows FDA to approve a drug for treatment if there is, number one, an unmet need for treatment. The disease is serious. And number two, there's evidence that the drug has an effect on a surrogate for clinical measures. Surrogate's a funny word, and I'll explain that more in just a bit. So the two key bits from the FDA's decision to grant accelerated approval are quoted here. First, that there was substantial evidence that Aduhelm reduces amyloid, and that this reduction is reasonably likely to predict important benefits to patients. So what the FDA said was, the evidence that the drug reduces amyloid, which you saw back in 2016 on the cover of Nature, was sufficient evidence to approve the drug because the FDA also felt that there was decent, reasonable evidence that if you reduce amyloid, you're going to benefit a person living with Alzheimer's disease. The second key decision that FDA made last Monday was to require Biogen, the owner of the drug, to conduct a new randomized controlled clinical trial to verify the drug's clinical benefits. The design and conduct of that study has yet to be announced, and the CEO of Biogen estimates it might take about 8 to 9 years to complete that study. Second, the label for the drug. The label is FDA talk for the small font, multi-page document that accompanies a prescription. FDA people like to joke that we know no one reads the label, but it's extremely important because the label describes the kinds of patients who can receive a drug, its risks, its benefits, how it's dosed, etc. It's extremely important information to guide physicians like David and myself, to guide you because the label's out there for you to read. It's also used by insurers to decide who are the kinds of individuals who can benefit from receiving an intervention. Notably, the label for aducanumab has no restrictions on the severity of someone's Alzheimer's disease. It simply says for the treatment of Alzheimer's. It doesn't talk in greater detail about whether those individuals should have, it works in individuals who have, say, mild cognitive impairment or some stage of dementia. Secondly, the label doesn't speak to the need to confirm that someone has amyloid though it does certainly talk about other tests needed for assessment of safety. So last week, aducanumab became Aduhelm. That is to say, rebranded, renamed into this drug that is owned by Biogen and now could be marketed for sale to healthcare systems, to patients following a prescription by a physician. I'll wrap up with what are the controversies now where we're at. Well, first, as the evidence to support approval of the drug, as you could tell, was controversial. I myself have written that I don't feel the evidence was sufficient to approve the drug for approval. Another study needed to be done, a study that might very well show the drug is actually effective and should be prescribed. FDA's task is to offer reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And the decision they made, though, was on the basis of not on the advisory committee's discussion of whether the drug had an effect on the biomarker that could translate into a clinical effect. That was not what was discussed by the advisory committee. There never was an advisory committee hearing to discuss accelerated approval. Moreover, one could argue that the consensus on amyloid as a meaningful surrogate remains a consensus in progress within the community. The last several years has seen great progress to move towards that, but arguably on June 6th, the statement that amyloid was a meaningful surrogate for the treatment of Alzheimer's, I think most would have said was still a statement of a work in progress, not a conclusion for clinical practice. And then finally, with a controversy over the Aduhelm is the announcement that the drug's annual price per patient is $56,000. So what's next? Medicare, so the drug has been approved by FDA, but the next task is in America, health insurance pays for drugs often, and what will health insurance do? So many persons who have Alzheimer's disease are over 65 and therefore beneficiaries of Medicare. And Medicare, as well as other insurers, have tasked as their duty to decide whether a service is reasonable and necessary. Should I provide payment for a service that is reasonable and necessary? So the question before Medicare is Aduhelm, for what kinds of patients is this service reasonable and necessary? For reasons we'll develop during the questions, I think that the broadness of the label that I gave you some hints to will require that Medicare will have to engage in some determination of what kinds of patients will benefit from this drug. And it's almost certain, I think, that there'll be some process for what's known as a coverage with evidence determination process. No doubt there will maybe be a copay on the drug as well. The amount of that is unknown. What's also next are treatment guidelines from professional organizations like the American Academy of Neurology, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Geriatric Society. And no doubt that those guidelines will certainly differ a bit and will interact with coverage decisions. And finally, what's next is thinking about the impact of this approval on the design and conduct of future studies to develop better treatments for Alzheimer's disease. One of the questions that lingers is how Biogen will conduct the mandated FDA trial for a new randomized and controlled clinical trial to verify the drug's benefits. As you can imagine, it would be difficult to conduct a clinical trial using randomization, blinding, and a placebo control, while at the same time that drug is available for prescription. That is a question in progress. So those are the summary slides just to help set the stage of the facts and the events that have occurred. Let me stop the screen share and now open it up for question and answer. So let me first turn to David here with a question. David, several questions here. Hang on, this is calling us the screen. So let's talk about this drug aducanumab and situate it into the other drugs that target amyloid that have been developed or that are currently being developed. And if you could just sort of foreground how this drug is similar to those drugs or different, those other anti-amyloid drugs.
Sure. I think before I answer that, though, I'd like to make a few comments that I'll try to keep brief, as well, because I do want to get to a lot of the questions. But one, I do think it's important that we as a field appreciate sort of the context of what's happened here. I started, I guess I finished my fellowship in 2004 after the last drug that was approved for Alzheimer's disease was approved, memantine or Namenda. And so my entire research and clinical career, we haven't had any new approvals of drugs. And so the mere fact that we have developed tools where we can actually see the amyloid plaques of Alzheimer's disease, as well as the Tangle's disease, the fact that a crazy idea of giving an immune-based drug to remove or to target amyloid in the brain can be given, and that you can actually then see with a scan removal of that amyloid from the brain is really remarkable. And so I think one thing to keep in mind with any kind of consideration about aducanumab and the value of this drug is that I think this is a hopeful time. And I don't want that to get lost in any of the sort of comments that we make about the drug. And the other thing I will just say is I think people's view on this drug is gonna, like any views, are gonna be very much influenced by the lens through which they see it. And I think there's a lens from a scientific standpoint, from a clinician standpoint. I think there's a lens from a patient standpoint, an advocacy standpoint. And then I think there's a lens from a societal standpoint. And I do think one of the concerns with this drug is just the overall costs to our healthcare system, given the number of people that potentially could qualify for it, even with the narrow criteria that Biogen had for the particular study. And so I think all of those things play a role in how each of us think about it. That being said, I think Jason did a great job of summarizing the evidence for the effectiveness of this drug, and that clearly this drug didn't meet the standards by which we have generally approved drugs in the past. And in some sense, that's explicit in the FDA's decision that this did not meet those standards, and therefore we're accelerating approval with the idea that a future study needs to be done. I think kind of linked to that as well, there's very mixed data, and so to some extent, what's the evidence in favor of it? And I think that in some ways gets a little bit into the question that Jason and actually you all posed, Jason Red, which is, how does this drug differ from some of the other drugs out there? And I think a common theme is this idea that, all these drugs targeting amyloid have failed. So this one gave mixed results. Why should we believe anything about this drug or any of the other trials that we're doing right now? And so there have been kind of two main ways that drugs have targeted amyloid historically. One is that they've used drugs to inhibit the production of amyloid. So amyloid comes from a larger protein called the amyloid precursor protein, and it's kind of broken down, and a bad form of it forms these plaques. And so there've been a series of trials looking at drugs that impede that production of A-beta, and those drugs have universally failed. And in fact, actually, those drugs, if anything, have shown people doing a little bit worse on them than off of them. They clear amyloid a little bit from the brain, but to a very, very modest extent. There's been a whole other class of drugs, which are these immune-based drugs, actually originally started with what was, I think, just an incredibly courageous idea of vaccinating people against amyloid in the brain, led by Dale Schenk, which was an injection of A-beta into the brain or into the blood, and then you got an immune response, and that cleared amyloid. That approach led to side effects in individuals that were intolerable and was discontinued. But since then, there have been a number of these passive immunization approaches, which is what aducanumab is, which is where you give someone an antibody to the plaques or to A-beta, and which is the protein that makes those plaques, and to see if you can either remove or stop the deposition of amyloid in the brain. And each of these different immune-based drugs target different pieces of these proteins or plaques. Some of them target things that you would only see in the form of a plaque, and some actually target the proteins that make up those plaques when they're insoluble, before they kind of form these plaques. So when they're soluble, when they're in fluid or just made up of a few molecules. And so one of the things in interpreting different studies is they all attack different stages of amyloid. And amyloid actually has a kind of lifespan of being individual molecules to forming clumps in fluid to then being deposited in the brain. And the one thing that I will say that is that we've seen is a number of failed trials with these kinds of drugs, but many of them have shown actually very little clearance of amyloid. The earlier ones that had failed, like bapineuzumab, which was one that was a very highly touted drug, actually really didn't clear amyloid all that much, whereas a sort of second generation of these drugs show much, much more clearance of amyloid from the brain. And I will say with those drugs, so there's one called donanemab, which is developed by Lilly, and we're doing that trial with that drug right now. There's one called lecanemab, which is also part of a preclinical trial that we're doing as a center. And there's one called gantenerumab. Those drugs all seem to clear amyloid kind of like what aducanumab does. And I would say in each of them, they've all shown some degree of signal that they might slow down the course of the disease or affect downstream changes that you see in the brain related to the tau protein that builds up in the brain as well. And so I think that whole approach is not sort of off the table as something that might be effective. And so, and aducanumab sort of falls into that bin of things that, show some promise, but that right now, again, I think there's just uncertainty about their effectiveness.
Good. Another question that's come in is directed to me, namely that I've written and spoken about how I didn't think FDA should approve the drug. And so what will I do now that, of course, it's approved? And the answer very simply and clearly is I will prescribe it. And let me explain why. So I conceive of Alzheimer's disease as a disease that goes after a person's autonomy. It goes after their ability to self-determine their life and live the way they want to live, early and relentlessly. And I've written on that. So FDA approved the drug. I have to respect that process. And if after a discussion of the drug's uncertainties, risks, cost, other factors, which we'll talk about more, family, patient, and I do think it's going to be a decision by a family, decides they want to take it, I will prescribe it. Although I will say I'm a reluctant prescriber for the reasons that David articulated and I have articulated otherwise. In summary, I'm very on board with the FDA's decision, namely one half of it, namely another trial needed to be done. So that's where I'm at, and that's where we're at as a center as well. And so we've already begun meetings with our colleagues in the health system to organize how we will begin to prescribe this drug in clinical practice. And so maybe, David, let's take on some of the questions on the topic of sort of what's next, if you will, okay? So maybe think about some of the parameters to prescribe the drug, David. If you could sort of reflect, knowing what you know from the studies that were done, from the FDA label, what your thoughts are about how one would go about rationally prescribing this drug to patients with Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, so I think one is I think just as Jason said, these are I would also prescribe the drug, and that these are discussions, and one has to weigh the potential but certainly unknown benefits of the drug with known side effects, which as Jason said, we can get into in a few minutes. And in essence, that's what we do, what people do when they enter a clinical trial. Drug might work, might not. There are side effects. Should I go into that trial? The difference here is this is now clinical practice when people are making those decisions. The label was very broad, as Jason said, and can include Alzheimer's disease itself. That name has a broadness to it because there's now arguments that Alzheimer's disease begins even before people have symptoms based on biomarkers of the disease. And so the question is, who should we prescribe it to with Alzheimer's? And my feeling is that we don't know a lot. We don't know with certainty whether the drug works in the narrow definition that Biogen defined for their enrollment in the study. We know way less about it in people who are outside that range. And in particular, a group that I would worry the most about in terms of the risk-benefit profile are people further along in the disease course. And in part because as the disease progresses, there becomes more and more amyloid in the brain and more involvement of blood vessels, which might be related to some of the side effects that are seen in the drug with regard to these the ARIA that Jason mentioned earlier, the swelling and bleeding that can occur with the drug. And so I would be very reluctant to prescribe outside of the range that was defined in the study. And then just one other piece of that is I think there's more and more understanding, not definitive, that these drugs may be really specific in what kind of patient may respond to them. And in fact, the Lilly drug, donanemab, did a very narrow targeting of people at a very early stage of disease with just the beginnings of neurodegeneration, which is thought to be perhaps a sweet spot with which these drugs work. And so I again, would be very reluctant to take this drug outside of a relatively narrow range.
And that range, to clarify, were individuals who had either mild cognitive impairment, a term that describes someone who has cognitive impairment that's causing inefficiencies in doing your daily activities like transportation, managing your money, using technology, inefficiencies. You get it done, but it's harder. Or mild stage dementia, which is defined by some need for assistance with those kinds of activities. There was a mini-mental cutoff as well to define the severity of overall cognitive impairment. David, isn't there some evidence that when the drug is used, and let me just develop a point you made, in individuals with more severe disease, moderate to severe to profound stage, that it actually may not work or be harmful?
Yeah, there's not great data about harm in that population, although there's certainly biological reason to think that it might be more harmful. But one thing that none of the studies that have shown hints of signal with these kinds of approaches have ever really shown evidence of benefit in patients beyond that narrow window that Biogen used, which was a mini-mental above 24. And so I think in many, most studies are not even looking at these kinds of drugs for those populations because, at least in the experience of prior trials, there's been no evidence of signal for those individuals. And so there you might be more likely to be taking all the risk and not getting any even potential benefit.
Right. Several questions have come in asking about the timeline for when the drug will be available at the Penn Memory Center. David and I can't give you sort of precise dates, and times, but I think a key actor that has yet to make an important set of decisions here are the insurers. Right now, I think the drug might be available as early as next week. That is to say, Biogen is shipping it out, so to speak, to infusion centers, as they say. But I think if a prescription were written right now, the insurer that would get that prescription would say, I'm not sure, actually. But one might be faced with a big out-of-pocket expense for the $56,000 divided by roughly 12 costs, plus the cost of imaging. In addition, just to develop that point a little bit more, the imaging needed to get this drug includes amyloid imaging or some other test for amyloid. And right now, amyloid imaging is not covered by Medicare. If David or I wrote a prescription for an amyloid PET scan, it would not be covered. So there are some decisions that need to be made by Medicare as one of the larger insurers, but also some of the other Medicare Advantage plans, most certainly, as to what kind of criteria they want to use to decide that someone has this service is reasonable and necessary for them. I recognize that folks may say, well, there are those insurers once again stepping in and making decisions. I think we have to see their perspective from Medicare, given the size of the potential patient population, the annual cost of the drug. You have to see the perspective of wide open prescription, where all one has to do is say someone has Alzheimer's, would simply be untenable in the Medicare budget. We're talking about not millions, but billions of dollars of money, given the estimated 5 million people with Alzheimer's disease in the United States at a $56,000 a year cost. And so it's just only rational that there has to be some decisions around what kinds of patients, which got to the points that David was raising around severity of disease, detection of amyloid, and also decisions about how, after someone is on the drug, how long they should be on it based on how they're doing. Those are all going to be worked out, I think, in the coming weeks to months. And so I can't say when we'll be able to prescribe it, but I think we're talking about weeks to months, certainly. David, do you have any further thoughts to add on that?
No, I mean, I would sort of err more on the side of months. I think it's, the university or the health system itself has its own sort of set of processes that have to go on. And just to echo Jason's point, even with the narrow window of the Biogen study, that's at least 1 million people in the United States. And at $56,000 a year, that's over $50 billion just for the drug. That doesn't include all the other care-related costs, including the imaging. And just to amplify one other point, the label doesn't define the need for an amyloid PET scan or evidence of amyloid for treatment. I think our community, I think, and this probably is universal, all feel that we need to know whether there's amyloid in your brain before we give you a drug that's going to target, amyloid,
yes,
especially at that cost.
And David's remark and my concurrence on it, though, get to a point which several questions have asked, which is, how's it going to be decided who gets the drug, if you will? And the answer to that is the individual doctor-patient team. That is to say, Dr. Wolk, Dr. Vaishnavi, Dr. Manning, myself, Dr. Kapoor, each of us, as we engage in clinical encounters, will work on that decision with patients and their families. Of course, as I pointed out, I have no doubt there'll be some need for information passed on to an insurer for their coverage decision on this. This happens, for example, right now as we speak. For example, we prescribe an FDG PET, a PET scan to measure metabolic activity in the brain. Many insurers ask us to fill out a form to confirm certain characteristics of the patient to see if the PET scan should be covered. So it's not an uncommon event that occurs across all of medicine when a therapy is expensive, risky, and/or has variable benefits across patients, to require some degree of documentation that this is the right patient to receive this drug at this time, and or down the road that it remains the right drug for this patient. That's not at all uncommon. That will not be unique. Now, a little bit more about, David has been asked of us about how we're going to sort of decide with a patient and family. And many of the questions have revolved around matters of sort of tell us more about what the risks of the drug are. Before you answer that, I just want to say one of the risks of the drug that's a unique risk, an unusual risk, is the risk that it may not benefit. And I know that sounds disturbing, but that gets back to FDA's point that another study is needed to confirm the benefit. That gets back to the points that folks like myself and others had raised, that that's what we wanted done, was one more study to show that this drug actually benefited. Having said that, again, the drug is out there, it's been approved, but that means that you have to engage in a very difficult cognitive exercise of, I might be, in the sense, taking a drug that doesn't benefit. And that's where things get really, in my own head, I almost feel this tension. That's why I wanted to study, because I would want to have someone in the study to measure across all the many people, whether it's benefiting or not, to really get the right evidence as we monitor the subjects and determine that. That's not the case. If you take it clinically, it's a sort of clinical trial of one, but we're open to doing that. So uncertainty of benefit, that's one thing you got to get your head around. David, what about the risks of the drug? What's known about the risks? Can you describe more what ARIA is, how you detect it, and if it happens, what happens to a patient who experiences ARIA? So please.
Yeah, so ARIA which is called amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, is the main sort of side effect of the drug. And ARIA actually occurs in patients with Alzheimer's disease who aren't treated with any drug at a very low frequency, which is where there's inflammation around blood vessels, which causes some brain swelling locally, and little tiny bleeds that we call microhemorrhages, which are often asymptomatic, but something that individuals will have, that we'll see actually when we're evaluating someone for Alzheimer's disease in the clinic, again, without exposure to the drug. However, with the drug, there are pretty high rates of people developing some of these inflammatory changes or increases in these little hemorrhages, and sometimes even larger hemorrhages that can occur. The rate by which people developed those findings in the trials, and this is somewhat consistent across these different drugs, although a little bit variable depending on the nature of the drug. It's about a third of people, or slightly higher, develop these kinds of brain changes. Of those people that develop those brain changes, probably less than a quarter of them have any symptoms at all related to it. So most of the time, 75% of the time, at least in the studies, these were picked up with so-called surveillance MRI scans, where someone had an MRI and it showed evidence of these changes, but the person had no symptoms at all associated with it. In the people with symptoms, oftentimes they were really mild. They were like headache, a little bit of lightheadedness, sometimes a little bit of visual disturbance, or balance issues. And for the most part in the study, what would happen is you would show that evidence on a scan and you would hold the drug, and the vast majority of people, they returned back to their prior baseline so that these symptoms went away. However, in about probably less than 1%, there were more severe neurologic outcomes that resulted in more chronic kinds of neurologic issues related to where in the brain these changes occurred. And so this would be something that we'd have to monitor quite closely if one were to be put on the drug clinically at this point. And the FDA has certain recommendations for when you would get MRI scanning to follow this, but it would be something that we would have to keep a close eye on, and can have real neurologic consequences, although also, to be balanced, is something that was reasonably well managed in the study with close surveillance.
So just to develop that more, David, the key way that you surveil for ARIA is to do an MRI of the brain.
Yeah, so what you do is an MRI, the biggest risk, and because I think this is a question later on, or that someone had asked, is with the dose escalation and at the beginning stages of the highest dose of the drug. And so one should get an MRI, one before you actually even enter the study, because there's some evidence that if you show some of these microhemorrhages, you're at really high risk for this. And those would be people we would recommend not to take the drug. And
so a starting MRI even before you get the drug? Before you get the drug.
Okay. And in fact, the trial didn't allow anyone with more than 2 of these I think it's 2.
Yeah, don't worry, but some number couldn't get in if you had microhemorrhages.
Yeah. Right. And then you would get an MRI scan during the dose escalation period, around 7 or 8 weeks. And then after a few weeks of being on the highest, or a few months, I should say, of being on the highest dose of the drug, you get a repeat MRI. That being said, in the study, if you came to me, if one of our patients said, Bob is having a lot of problems with headache and dizziness, that would be someone we'd have a very low threshold to also get an MRI at that point to make sure.
Because they're not feeling well.
Yeah, and so that will be something that we'll certainly again monitor closely.
So in summary, we've got a lot of questions about kind of what's the brass tacks about how the drug is given. And what I've heard you say, I'll say it back and you correct me, Dave. So the person fits the sort of severity of disease that has the window that we think is beneficial. Again, that caveat of we're not confident about the benefit. Let's set that aside. So that clinical assessment is done. Then they need to show whether or not they have amyloid in their brain, elevated amyloid, which is seen in persons with Alzheimer's disease. If they don't have elevated amyloid, then they don't have Alzheimer's disease, right? Then they need an MRI of their brain to look for those microhemorrhages. And as you pointed out, if there's a certain number of them or more, the drug would be not indicated because it's quite risky for causing more of those microhemorrhages. And then they would start a series of escalating infusions. It's an intravenously dosed drug. It's given how often, David?
It's a monthly dosing. So
every 4 weeks you come in or you somehow get an intravenous infusion, either someplace that does it, right? And then soon after the infusions go, there's another MRI that's needed, right? And then after a few months at the top dose, which is 10 milligrams, there's another MRI.
Correct.
Now, along the way, if someone starts to feel dizzy, headache, doesn't seem to be doing it right in ways that suggest these little microhemorrhages, they need to come in and get another MRI.
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, David, the literature, although the label of the drug doesn't talk about this, so if folks read the label, they won't read this. But the literature, doesn't it say that if you have a certain copy of the ApoE gene, you have a greater risk of getting the microbreeds?
Yeah, so it's been pretty well known actually, again, for all of these drugs, that if you carry the apolipoprotein E4 allele, which is the sort of biggest risk gene for Alzheimer's disease, which about half of people with Alzheimer's have and about half don't have. But if you have that risk allele, the rate of these sort of side effects go up pretty significantly relative to if you don't carry this allele. And so that may be also a consideration for people in terms of weighing the risk benefit of enrolling in a study is depending on what their genetic status is, which we don't actually routinely test in individuals because it doesn't necessarily help us diagnostically, and it's far from a definitive test that to tell you about what family members' risk is, but that may be something that we would add into our routine evaluation as well to help weigh people's overall risk of some of these side effects.
So let's parse that out, because I think that's an important point, that there's a genetic test that is available, although we don't routinely do it at the Memory Center, but there are commercial, actually direct-to-consumer opportunities to learn one's ApoE gene. But before everyone goes out and gets an ApoE gene, remember, if I find out I have an ApoE gene, especially if I have 2 copies of it, any biological children I have at least 1 copy. And I won't develop that point, but just remember the decision to learn one's ApoE genotype ramifies across families who are related by blood. And we've studied how this has an impact in families. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's a matter of personal choice. But that personal choice has to be informed by knowledge about what it means to learn that genetic result. It's not whether it's right or wrong to learn it, but you need to know what you're getting involved in if you decide to pursue genetic testing to better understand your risk and therefore also the implications of learning that gene result. David, when you get the medicine, is it like you start getting better, like after being on it for a while? Well, we were a site for the studies, and so we have some experience from our own patients who are a site for Biogen's study of this. We've been a site for a number of years, and we're currently a site. We'd like to be a site for the confirmatory trial. So David, as we were using it here, and also when you looked at the data, especially, what happens? Do people start getting better, like after 3-4 months or some period of time? They do, or what's the effect? How do you know it's working? I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So I mean, one just other point about the side effects, and then I'll answer that for sure. I will say that if the drug were effective or surely effective, these side effects are, conceivably manageable. And so I want to throw these, it's not, they weren't at such an unacceptable level that, data safety monitoring boards and otherwise were like, we can't even go on with these drugs. And so I think it's that perspective is important. With regard to what happens, I mean, these drugs are really designed to try to slow down the course of the disease. So they don't offer symptomatic benefit. So we wouldn't expect anyone on the drug, and we didn't see anyone on the drug, at least anecdotally, that gets better because they're on the drug.
So David, let me follow that up. Yeah. So if I gave a drug to someone with Parkinson's, where they have that movement disorder, the way I know they're better is they start walking smoothly, etc. What you're saying is, if I give this drug to someone with Alzheimer's, after a couple months, we're not going to see that they're suddenly not asking as many repetitious questions or having trouble with their taxes. So that's what you're saying.
Yeah, and that is the challenge in our field, even for doing good clinical trials, and why a drug like Biogen, why we're even having this discussion now, because if this were a drug that really clearly improved people's thinking or was designed to do so, I think it would be easier to do that trial. And as you all know on this call, because I'm sure you all have some family experience with this, it's a slow moving disease. And so what you're trying to look for with a drug is, are you making that slow moving disease a little bit slower than what it would be without the drug? And the problem is, in each individual case, you don't have the counterfactual, which is what they would have looked like off of the drug.
Right.
And so that's why we rely on big trials to compare groups on drug versus not. But the hope would be that you would, that the drug you would move more slowly along in the disease course on the drug versus off of the drug.
So for example, a way to think about that might be, so when Ronald Reagan had his Alzheimer's, had he been on aducanumab, it might have taken, say, an additional 2 years before, say, he had trouble recognizing George Shultz when George Shultz visited him. A very intimate functional measure. But again, unlike treating Parkinson's with L-Dopa or depression with an antidepressant where the person gets better, this is a drug that changes its trajectory of decline and unfolds over years. And I think what you're getting at, David, it's why we do these trials, because it's so hard if you don't compare two groups over time to see a difference.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't, I think for me as a clinician to know whether there would be a difference with a drug like this, at least through my gut, it would really actually take a few years for me to be able to know whether a drug is really working or not for Alzheimer's, because it is such a slow disease with such variability in how quickly people progress with the condition, that if I saw someone who didn't progress a lot over a year or two, it still might be in the range of what sometimes we see in people. And if I saw someone progress more quickly over 2 or 3 years, it's still, that too could be within the range. And so as a clinician, I think, that's in part why we are so reliant on these placebo-controlled trials, particularly in this disease, and particularly for drugs who are designed to slow down the course of the disease. Now, of course, if I'm following people and 5 years later, they look like what they looked like 5 years ago, that would be pretty strong evidence that at least there's some reason to at least believe that's not the typical progression of disease. But these trials are 1.5 years. They're very short, and that's the time frame we really know about with these drugs.
So we talked a bit more. Let's talk a bit more about how people will be monitored. So we've talked obviously about the MRIs that are looking for safety issues. What are other ways that a clinician is going to understand how a patient's doing on this drug? What are some other things that you think we'll be doing here at the Memory Center?
Yeah, so I think that's a challenge, is to figure out what are the things that we will use as metrics for individuals on this drug. I think what we generally do now is we follow people on at least a 6-month to yearly basis. And so we'll follow people clinically, obviously, and that's going to help us determine to some extent the degree to which people are declining over time, and will give us, again, a flavor, but there's such incredible variability across individuals. I think that the question of, do you repeat an amyloid PET scan to see if it's actually hitting its target, if you will, and lowering levels of amyloid, I think is unclear with the data that we have now. And geez, I sure do hope Biogen makes some of their data available for us to be able to look at, people who when there is clearance of amyloid, are those just the ones that do better with the drug, or if there's no change in their amyloid status, are those people who don't show an effect, or are those things decoupled? And I think we just don't know right now how we will follow this in terms of determining the effectiveness of the drug. And I do want to, because it relates actually to one of the questions on the chat, I do want to also add another thing that adds an additional complication, is that, and we have work in this area, is that even when people have amyloid in their brain and have symptoms of the disease, or have symptoms of cognitive impairment, amyloid is such a ubiquitous thing in older adults that you can have amyloid in the brain and it might not be the cause of why you're having cognitive symptoms. And there's some data to support that other markers might help you know if you're mild cognitive impairment, for example, and you have amyloid in your brain, whether it's more or less likely that that's what's driving your symptoms or not. And some people can have amyloid in their brain and not get worse for a number of years. And I think that as we start to prescribe this medicine, we're going to need, as a field, to start thinking about incorporating some of these other measures, because heck, I don't know if I want to take this drug if I have amyloid in my brain, but it's unlikely I'm going to have change in my symptoms over 4 or 5 years. I don't know if I want to take that risk on without being likely to change, versus someone else who is much more likely to change. And again, that's just, this is a very kind of complicated and nuanced area in terms of our ability to predict what's going to happen in individual cases, which again is why it'll be very hard for us to monitor on an individual patient basis whether or not we're actually truly seeing an effect of the drug, or there's some other factor that's playing a role here.
So we're closing to the top of the hour, and David, thanks so much for putting up with my hammering you with questions. I want to remind everyone that this is the beginning, not the end, of a conversation around this drug, and more generally around the events that have been occurring in the field. We are committed to having another one of these town halls if you want one. If you don't want one, we won't do it, number one. And number two, we'll try to get the answers to your questions out there in other formats, such as through our Insight, Weekly Insight. And in the chat room, Terry Casey has inserted a link to subscribe to our Insight if you're already not a subscriber. It comes out every Sunday, and we repeat the mailing on every Wednesday. I think when I think about what we face as a field now, I have a drug available that I wish was still being studied in a clinical trial, not because all I want to do is research, not because it brings me in money or whatever. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak in that kind of personal way, but because I think that yet one more study, which is what the FDA wanted, could have got us the information we need. Having said that, the drug is available, and for those who, after learning about the uncertainties, the risks, the ways what things you have to do to take it, it will be available. And we are going to work with our colleagues here to get that drug available for those for whom it can be prescribed. Another point, though, is between now and when it's prescribed, available, excuse me, we have to work, not we personally, David and I and our colleagues, but America has to work together with our insurers, Medicare and others, to lay out who are the kinds of individuals for whom this is a reasonable service to offer, and that decision still has to be made. Again, my prediction is that there will be a coverage with evidence development process. I'll offer that I think what might happen is a national trial where in some areas of America it's available, in other areas it's not, in order to gather evidence to compare. That's just speculation based on what they've done in other areas. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but I think there's another act here to follow, which is the need for the insurers to make some decisions about how to use this drug. David, let me just give you the last words here, and then we'll turn it over to Terry Casey.
Yeah, no, I guess I'll just sort of add, again, now that this drug is available, I think we as a clinician team owe it to all of you to really be empathetic to your decision making for this, because I am sure a very difficult decision for a number of you to make. And I think you obviously carry as an individual or as a family your own perspective on this. And so our goal is to really kind of talk people through what we know about the drug, where we don't know things about the drug. And actually, we also owe it to you all to learn as much as we can about the drug. And I don't just mean like reviewing the data that's out there, but making sure that we as a clinical community really share and develop our own data to better understand how to use this drug or likely other drugs that will be approved down the line that have similar mechanisms to them. And
thanks, Dave.
Thank you all
Terry
for
Casey.
attending.
Terry Casey, you want to take it home here for us?
Sure. Thank you both so much. We've got a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of thanks in the chat. And we're committed to making sure we recap that as much as possible. And I know this was already addressed, but whether it's helpful through other events or through kind of a summary Q&A, I'm going to share my email address is in here, tjcasey@upenn.edu. You can feel free to email me at any time with follow-up questions, anything that you felt went unaddressed or any additional concerns. This will be an ongoing conversation. I don't see this dialogue slowing anytime soon. So please feel free to reach out at any time or reply to the next edition of Insight. That'll get to me as well. But thank you everyone for coming out today, and we appreciate the tremendous feedback.
Thank you, Terry. Bye, everyone.
See you, everyone.